A serial killer is delivering death door to door. Detectives move in to stop him before he kills again.
Because I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Bodies begin turning up in Northern California. Investigators search for a common denominator and find a pattern of uncommon cruelty. For years, a deadly predator has taunted police while snaring victim after victim. With every kill, he grows bolder, while authorities grow more desperate to catch him. Serial killers don't stop on their own. As the body count rises, investigators must use all of their resources to put an end to their murder by numbers. Some of the names in this episode have been changed. January 12, 1990 was another beautiful day in San Diego. But Chris Burns wasn't enjoying it. He was growing concerned over the whereabouts of his fiancée. When his roommates came home, Burns asked if they'd seen Tiffany Schultz, who also shared the apartment.
No, I haven't seen her all day. Why?
Because her car's downstairs.
Her car was in the parking lot, but in the several hours that Burns had been home, she hadn't appeared. The other roommates hadn't seen her either. Then they opened the door to a nightmare.
What's going on? Oh my God!
Schultz lay dead, partially disrobed and covered in blood.
You guys, call the cops! Get somebody here, all right?
Burns stayed with her while his roommates called police. As detectives interviewed Burns and his roommates, San Diego homicide investigators inspected the crime scene. One of the first things they noticed was that the body was posed, with outstretched arms and legs. Bruises indicated that the victim had struggled fiercely for her life. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. There was no sign of sexual assault. The answering machine tape was taken to check for suspicious messages. As the technicians continued working, Chris Burns told detectives his story.
And I put my hands up under her head like this to hold
They
her
noticed
head
his
so
hands
I
and pants were marked with blood. The situation gave Sergeant Ed Petrick of the San Diego Police Homicide Unit grave doubts about Burns.
It seemed very odd to anybody that here would be a fellow that comes home, house is open, his girlfriend's nowhere around, but her keys are there, her car's there, her purse is there, but she's nowhere around. And there's a roommate's door to the bedroom that's closed, which is usually never closed, and he never bothers to knock or open it.
Burns was taken to the police station for further questioning about his fiancée's murder. He admitted that he and Schultz were having problems.
Let me tell you why I brought you in here.
The grisly slaying came at a time when they were supposedly trying to salvage their relationship. Lately, they couldn't get along. Now, Schultz was dead, and Burns looked like the main suspect. The blood on his clothes told police all they needed to know. But Burns claimed that the stain on his shirt came from touching Schultz after he discovered her dead. He believed the blood on his pants was his own, from a recent accident on the construction site where he worked. The story seemed too contrived. Chris Burns was arrested and charged with the murder of Tiffany Schultz.
I can do that.
It's not quite that.
Schultz's autopsy revealed she was stabbed nearly 60 times. While researching this brutal homicide case, Police learned that the victim was paying her way through college by dancing at a nightclub.
Oh, yeah.
The manager confirmed that Schultz's relationship with Burns was tumultuous. She told police that he didn't want her working there. They often came to blows over it. Their last incident had been recent. Transcripts from the answering machine tape contained an apology from Burns for the hard time he gave his fiancée about her job. But police wondered if he'd lost his temper and his control one last time. Only careful forensic analysis of the evidence could determine if Schultz was the victim of Burns's rage. Burns's shirt and pants were sent to the lab to determine whose blood was on them. To better see the bloodstains, the jeans were turned inside out. When the results were positive, ABO blood typing was performed. The blood on the shirt matched Schultz's AB blood type.
But I'm sure we should.
But the blood on the pants was type O, Burns's own type. Serologist Larry Turner of the Jackson Police Department Crime Lab performed the analysis.
Based on what I found, I was able to determine that the story that Chris Burns had been telling, it was possible that it was true. The blood on his clothing matched him and not that of Tiffany Schultz, and on his t-shirt where he said he had been down to touch her and possibly gotten some of her blood on the t-shirt, that was correct as well.
Burns's story, as odd as it seemed, might be true. Police had no other evidence with which to hold him. He was released, though still considered the prime suspect. But police would soon regret releasing him. On February 16, 1990, 1 month after Tiffany Schultz was found murdered, police got another call to the same apartment complex.
Take a deep breath.
Another
for me,
victim
and
had
try to
been
relax
found,
a little bit.
brutally
Hey, Jay.
murdered.
What do you have?
You got this one in the kitchen.
The partially nude body of Janine Weinhold, a student at San Diego State University, was discovered by her roommate. She had been stabbed several times. As in the Schultz case, the killer also posed this body with the legs outstretched. Police feared they were dealing with a serial killer.
There just wasn't any question in our minds that it had to be the same suspect. Just the body position, the stab wound clusters in the chest, just looked like the same murder, basically, different room.
This murder occurred only about 100 yards from the apartment where the first victim was killed. Blood-stained clothes were found on the floor by the bed. The killer left the murder weapon, a carving knife, in the sink. But he left something else even more important. Seminal fluid was found on the bedspread. It provided evidence that the victim had been raped. It also provided police with their best hope for learning the killer's identity. In the lab, Larry Turner tested the evidence. In the early 90s, DNA testing was beyond the scope of most labs. Turner would have to rely on the older and less precise blood typing tests. He found that all of the blood and bodily fluids tested positive for type O.
What we're going to do is just...
The blood evidence cast further suspicion on Chris Burns, the primary suspect, who had type O blood.
take some of the material.
To be certain, Larry Turner analyzed the genetic markers within Burns's blood and in the fluid samples found at the murder scene. Genetic markers are inherited proteins that vary from individual to individual. While people may share some of the same ones, certain markers are more rare and can be used to make an ID. Genetic marker tests are dependable, but not nearly as precise as DNA. Turner found that the genetic markers of the suspect, Chris Burns, didn't match those taken from the second murder scene. That left investigators with 2 murders and no suspect.
Investigating the murder of the third in the apartment complex.
They returned to the apartment complex and interviewed female residents to see if they'd seen anyone suspicious.
Okay, now what part
Police
of the space
feared
were
that
you in?
these 2 victims were just the beginning.
And he came from the park?
3400 Claremont Drive, that's right in the
Detectives
light
created a list of over 1,000 suspects from the leads they gathered from the victims' friends and acquaintances.
about a block away. There's a couple of burglaries.
With 2 murders unsolved, the police were casting a wide net, trying to find their man before he killed again. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. On April 3rd, 1990, 2 months after the Weinhold murder, police received an urgent call. A woman had been found brutally stabbed.
Is this a house or an apartment, sir? Sir, you need to calm down for me if you can. Okay, where is the suspect at in this?
A witness saw a man with a knife fleeing the scene, his face covered by a t-shirt.
Can you tell me, did he have the knife with him?
Police rushed to respond. They met Tammy Ho, who'd returned from the apartment swimming pool and found her friend, Holly Tarr, mortally wounded with a single stab through the heart. Holly Tarr's murder occurred in the same apartment building where the second victim, Janine Weinhold, was killed. Outside, police discovered the knife and the t-shirt held by the killer as he fled the scene. They also found a shoe print left in the mud, which they thought belonged to the suspect. Unfortunately, eyewitnesses couldn't identify him.
The girlfriend, Tammy, she basically couldn't give any description at all. Just, it was a male, you know, saw a flash go by. She couldn't help in that area. We had a second witness who at least pinned down the race of the suspect as being a black male.
The knife and t-shirt were clean of fingerprints or hair samples. After 3 murders, all investigators knew for sure was that the victims were all white females between the ages of 18 and 21, left semi-nude, posed with their legs outstretched and stabbed in the heart. All they knew about the killer was that he might be an African American. Because the slayings took place in the area of San Diego known as Claremont, the murderer was dubbed the Claremont Killer. A deadly predator, a serial killer, was on the loose. Police looked at their list of more than 1,000 suspects and, from those, re-interviewed all of their African American suspects again. Hundreds of blood and saliva samples were voluntarily obtained. While the samples were being tested, the killing continued. On May 22, 1990, another woman was murdered in her apartment in Mid-City, San Diego. The pattern of stab wounds was similar to the previous 3 murders. The Claremont Killer was on the move. 4 months later, 43-year-old Pamela Clark and her 18-year-old daughter Amber were found murdered in their San Diego home. Both partially nude bodies bore stab wounds around the heart and were posed like the previous victims.
There was no question after the double murder of the Clarks that things really got heated up. We had politicians show up at the mobile command post. I had detectives hadn't had a day off in 40 days, which was no problem. You know, we had to catch this guy. But we were back to square one.
Police had a terrifying killer on the loose with few clues and no idea of where he might strike next. Time was against them. Each day he ran free, more women were in danger. The Claremont killer laid low for 5 months, leaving San Diego investigators with nothing to go on. The trail heated up again on February 3rd, 1991, more than a year after he had made his first kill. Linda Parker, age 23, was about to take a shower when she heard noises at her front door. She looked through the peephole and saw a man trying to slip the lock. Linda Parker fled through her back door. She went to a neighbor's apartment, and together they confronted the would-be intruder,
Hey, buddy, what are you doing?
Oh, I was trying to get into my friend's apartment.
who mumbled an excuse as he left.
Wrong building.
Parker's neighbor noted the make and model of the man's car. Meanwhile, Parker called police, reporting a possible encounter with the Claremont killer. Parker suspected the man at her door had stalked her from a nearby gym. A previous victim, Pamela Clark, had worked out at the same gym right before her murder. Perhaps this was the killer's current spot for scouting victims. Officers distributed flyers and asked people at the gym if they had seen the man or the vehicle that Parker described. The next day, they received a call. Someone had spotted the man on the flyers sitting in his car outside the gym. Police apprehended the suspect. His name was Cleophas Prince. Police had interviewed him months earlier. He had declined to provide a blood sample. Police needed a sample if they hoped to compare Prince's DNA to crime scene evidence. To win his consent, they didn't let on that he was a murder suspect. They told him he was arrested for the attempted burglary of Linda Parker's home the prior day. Investigators checked his credit cards. Each had the marks of having been used to slip door locks. Prince cooperated and provided a blood sample without detectives having to resort to a warrant. Until the DNA results came back, police didn't have enough evidence to hold him. Prince was released, but he was kept under close surveillance. The blood sample was rushed to testing. If successful, the DNA would provide more solid evidence than genetic markers would. The problem was that in the early 90s, the technology was new, and it could take a year before the results came back. With nothing to hold the suspect, he would be free to kill again. With time running against them, investigators relied on a less comprehensive but faster test that would compare similarities between the sample and the crime scene DNA. If similarities existed, investigators could assume they were on the right track. If the DNA bore no superficial resemblance, they had the wrong man. Within a month, the results came back. The test indicated a match.
We just were, almost in tears. It was just unbelievable, the emotion involved in working with something and dealing with the families and all those crime scenes, and it was over.
Prince was located and arrested. Police were now able to gather more evidence and buy more time to run complete DNA tests. In Prince's possession were 2 rings that belonged to one of the victims. Police also found shoes with soles that matched the print left at a murder scene.
Hey, what's going on, bud?
Though police would never know what triggered his homicidal rage, they had a good idea of how his crimes evolved. Having perfected his craft as a burglar, he expanded his repertoire to include assault, rape, and murder. He tracked his victims from the gym and the pool, knowing that soon after they entered their apartments, they would be vulnerable while taking a shower. then break into their apartments and assault and stab them. Based on evidence gathered at the scenes, Prince was convicted of 6 murders. He awaits execution at San Quentin. Cleophas Prince actively sought his victims. Other serial killers wait for their prey to come to them. On May 3rd, 1983, in San Francisco, 2 55-gallon barrels were found in Golden Gate Park. Police had been called to the scene by 2 hikers who reported a foul odor coming from the barrels. Police suspected they might contain human remains. They were wrapped in plastic, their lids sealed with cement, but one was leaking. They were taken to police headquarters where they were x-rayed before they were opened so as not to disturb any evidence inside. The x-rays were sent to Dr. Boyd Stevens, chief medical examiner for the city and county of San Francisco.
One of the barrels had 2 bodies in it, and that was evident by 2 complete skeletons, including skulls and spinal columns, etc. One of the barrels had 1 body in it. We couldn't tell the sex at that time, but we could see that there were dental fillings, metal material consistent with bullet fragments or jackets, as well as identifying personal items like rings or earrings and so forth.
Now that they knew human remains were inside the barrels, investigators had to determine how they got there. Technicians took their time looking for any clues the killer might have left. Kenneth Moses, an inspector at the San Francisco Crime Lab, began by examining the exterior of the barrels. He hoped he could find some sort of print on the packaging or the tape. But getting clean fingerprints off tape can be tricky.
More oil.
Powder won't work because it sticks to everything. And most fingerprint chemicals dissolve the adhesive, destroying the print. Moses tried an experiment. By combining a dark blue dye, an antibiotic, and water, he concocted a dye called crystal violet. He hoped that when the tape was dipped into the solution, the antibiotic would stick to the protein left on a fingerprint, staining it purple.
After 14 hours of labor, slowly processing each strip of tape as it came off, we finally got down around 15 or 20 layers of tape to the last layer. Now, no prints were on any of those hundreds of yards of tape. Finally, we peel off the last piece of tape, put it into the crystal violet, and poof, up comes this beautiful fingerprint.
A simple magnifying glass revealed another crucial discovery. Presumably, the killer left a clear fingerprint behind in the fresh cement as he sealed one of the barrels. A synthetic polymer was mixed and carefully spread over the print. When it dried, it formed a near-perfect cast, which was then used to make a record of the print on paper. After 4 days of gathering all they could from the barrel's exteriors, investigators were ready to open them. One yielded the bodies of 2 nude females who'd been tied together. The women were later identified through their fingerprints as Glenda Wheatley and Paula Rodriguez, 2 prostitutes. Rodriguez worked for Thomas Michaels, identified as the clothed male victim in the other barrel. Each had been shot in the head. The victims had been ID'd, but the identity of their killer remained a mystery. Police spoke with friends of the victims, but none could shed any light on who could have done this. Investigators also ran the prints, but came up with no matches. 3 months after the barrels were found, a man driving on a rural road in California's San Mateo County, just outside of San Francisco, made a similarly gruesome discovery. He immediately summoned police. He led them to a bound female body with what looked like a bullet wound to the head. A grim trail of shredded clothing punctuated the horrific scene. Detective Sergeant Robert Morse deduced what it meant.
I need for you to go down to the... She had nylon rope extending from both of her ankles, and it appeared as though she had been dragged down the road. And we later measured off the distance, and she had indeed been dragged for 1.9 miles.
15 like part of the sweater. Well.
The entire area was secured, and each bit of evidence carefully noted. A garbage bag was found near the probable starting point of the brutal dragging. The first task after collecting all of the evidence was to identify the victim. Detectives ran a check on her fingerprints. She was identified as Marcia Geary, a prostitute from Oakland, California. Now, police knew her name. The next question was, how did she die?
The autopsy revealed that she had been shot in the back of the head. The trajectory going downward, approximately 45 degrees. The entrance wound was an oblong shape, which is a little bit unusual.
The nylon-coated .38 caliber bullet recovered from the victim was also unusual. It had none of the lands and grooves that a gun barrel usually etches on a slug as it passes through. Police were baffled by what kind of weapon could have fired the fatal shot. The garbage bag from the crime scene was closely examined for fingerprints and other trace evidence. The bag was tested with cyanoacrylate, or superglue. When heated, the chemical's fumes attached to the prints, making them visible. A latent footprint was discovered that was much too large to belong to the victim. All investigators needed was a suspect to compare the footprint to.
Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate that.
Police questioned Marcia Geary's friends and family to learn where she'd been and whom she'd met recently. Her father said the last time he saw her, she'd asked him for money. She told him she was trying to find a job and asked him if he would help her get a car. Police also learned from her friends that she was planning to spend the weekend with a man.
Thank you. Thank you.
For now, his identity remained a mystery.
Okay.
The day after Marcia Geary was found, the body of Catherine Barrett was discovered in a San Francisco cul-de-sac. She'd been tortured and stabbed to death. Her body was wrapped in plastic. Metal shavings were retrieved from the wrapping. As police investigated this latest murder, they got a tip from a man named Raleigh Hill, the owner of Marcia Geary's apartment. Hill told police that Geary was planning to see a man named Jack for the weekend. Hill didn't know Jack's last name, but he knew he lived in a warehouse.
What'd she tell you about Jack?
Just that she was going to see him.
Hill said that on 2 occasions, he dropped Geary off there for dates. Hill gave police the address. It was 20 miles from where Geary's body was found.
where Jack lives then.
Yeah, I could do that.
Get there and where it is. All right, take your team members.
The warehouse served as the offices of Anthony Electric, an electrical contracting business owned by a former police officer named Anthony John Sully,
We've explained that to you already. So here's how you
better known as Jack.
Okay, do you have any other questions about it? No. Okay.
Investigators also learned that friends of Catherine Barrett, the most recent victim, told them the day before her body was found that she was going to Anthony Electric. The news sparked their interest. The information gave them enough for a search warrant for the warehouse. They were about to learn the shocking truth about Jack Sully. A homicide investigation led to an electrical contractor's warehouse, where 2 murdered prostitutes were last reported to have been going.
Fort George William Sam 451.
A costumed woman wearing a tutu met police at the door. She led them to a small apartment in the rear of the warehouse. Among the litter of drug paraphernalia, police confronted a disoriented, partially clad Jack Sully. As they explored the room, the bizarre scene became grotesque.
Well, walking into this apartment, one gets the sense that it's almost like a torture chamber. He had a hook up on the ceiling. He had various ropes around. He had VCR tapes of pornography and sadism. And one would just get the feeling that it was a horrible place.
In a preliminary search of the apartment and surrounding warehouse, police found several important pieces of evidence, including a pistol with the barrel removed. It contained nylon-covered bullets, just like the one that killed Marcia Geary. A gun without a barrel might explain the odd oblong shape of the victim's wound, since a bullet shot from it would tend to be unstable and tumble instead of going straight. Jack Sully was arrested and charged with the murder of Marcia Geary.
Sheriff, go ahead and bring him this way.
The warehouse was now a crime scene and subject to a full-blown forensics investigation.
We photographed virtually every inch of it. We covered every inch of it. And we're happy that we did because we gained a lot of evidence out of it.
Finding anything in here at all? Got a couple
Among their finds were metal shavings and nylon rope, like those found at the crime scenes. Investigators also found blood, lots of it. The warehouse seemed to be a grim chamber of horrors, an inner sanctum for unspeakable acts of torture and cruelty. With Jack Sully behind bars, police began to ask his acquaintances what they knew about him. They learned he'd bragged about killing 3 people, putting them in barrels, and dumping them in Golden Gate Park. Now that a suspect was finally in custody, investigators could compare his prints against the ones taken from the barrels of the unsolved triple murder. As soon as he received samples of Sully's prints, Kenneth Moses knew the results.
I took a look at the prints, and believe me, I knew those prints by heart. The minute I saw Sully's prints, I knew this was the guy.
Sully was charged with the murders of the victims found in Golden Gate Park. Police also obtained his footprints. They compared them to the print lifted from the garbage bag found where Marcia Geary's body had been dragged. The prints matched. In the end, an insurmountable stack of forensics evidence was brought against Jack Sully. Metal shavings found in his warehouse matched shavings found on his second victim's body. The plastic sheeting found around the body of the man sealed in one of the 55-gallon barrels matched sheeting found in Jack Sully's truck. From the investigation, Sully's pattern of violence became clear. Under the influence of freebased cocaine, he would pick up prostitutes. When they arrived at his warehouse, he would subject them to prolonged periods of bondage, beatings, and sexual abuse, and ultimately, he murdered them. Forensics linked him to 5 victims, but other evidence proved he had killed 6. On June 3, 1986, Anthony John Sully was convicted of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death in California. Serial killers follow no apparent rules except one: to blend in with everyone else. On June 28, 1989, in Riverside, California, 2 construction workers stopped on the side of the road to eat their lunch. But then they noticed the body of a woman lying at the bottom of an embankment. Officers and forensic technicians from Riverside County Sheriff's Office responded to their call. The victim was dressed in shorts and a man's Western-style shirt. A towel covered her body. She had no identification. The autopsy revealed the woman was strangled to death. A search of the fingerprints file identified her as Tara Biggs, a 28-year-old prostitute. Evidence collected from the crime scene was sent to the California Department of Justice Crime Lab. Investigators found little more than a few assorted fibers. Whoever killed this woman didn't leave much evidence behind. On December 13, 1989, in Riverside, California, another female victim, Pamela Martin, was discovered on a rural road. She appeared to have been killed elsewhere, redressed, and abandoned there. Like the woman found 6 months earlier, she too was a prostitute. There were other similarities. Police found fibers similar to those found on the first victim. They also found tire tracks. Photographs were taken for examination in the lab. The photographs were blown up to actual size. The tread pattern and wear marks would be unique to the killer's vehicle. Criminalists identified 2 different brands of tires. They determined the killer probably drove a truck or a van with an alignment problem, causing the front tires to wear more quickly than the rear. The similarities between the crime scenes linked the 2 murders to a single killer, and he wasn't finished yet. In the 16 months following the discovery of the first victim, 6 more prostitutes were found murdered in and around Riverside. The information on the tires proved invaluable, according to Steve Sikowski of the California Department of Justice Crime Lab.
As subsequent victims were found, we were armed with the information of what kind of tire track we would be looking for, and that would be one of the first things that we could see whether or not, in fact, this is another one of the series that was developing.
When area police departments met to compare forensic evidence, they realized that along with the tire tracks, the hair and fiber evidence was consistent. Gray and red fibers, gold threads, and bits of rope were found on most of the bodies. These fibers lifted from the victims literally tied the murders together.
We were able to determine that, in fact, it looked like we had the same suspect environment from one victim to the next. And really what that meant to the investigation was it looked like we did in fact have a serial killer.
With each new murder, the killer grew bolder and more sadistic. Police found the body of another prostitute, Laura Mills, in a grove of trees, stabbed and strangled.
I don't know.
A peeled and partially eaten grapefruit lay nearby. This odd detail gave police an idea of the kind of monster they were dealing with, according to senior investigator Bob Creed.
To where he could just have murdered this person, strangled this person, stabbed this person, and then stood over her and ate a grapefruit. We felt that this told us something about the emotional makeup of this person that we were looking for.
Police seemed no closer to finding him. By 1991, 10 prostitutes had been murdered, and several had been redressed and left in rural areas. The only clues to the killer's identity were the fibers, hairs, and tire tracks that he left behind. But without suspects, this evidence amounted to nothing. Since the victims were prostitutes and drug users, police questioned women working the red light districts of Riverside and Elsinore. Men known to frequent these areas were investigated as potential suspects. One woman provided a description of a man who had roughed her up. A sketch was made from her description. It was distributed, but no lead surfaced. Investigators hoped to have better luck focusing on the killer's vehicle. The tires left their unique prints on each murder scene, and the interior may have provided the fibers found on the victims. If investigators could find his vehicle, they could find the killer.
So we let the investigators know to look for a vehicle with certain type tires on it. Let them know that they might be looking for a vehicle that had gray interior carpet. They might find some rope fibers. They might also find some other things in the van that had gold fibers in it, because we found a prevalence of gold type fibers. Maybe some blanket, sleeping bag along that line, because of the type fibers that we found on many of the victims.
At an earlier murder scene, police found the tread prints of a popular tennis shoe near the victim. As the spree of murders continued, forensic technicians began to see the same prints. As the tennis shoe's print continued turning up, the tread showed increasing wear. Likewise, the tire tracks found at the scenes were changing, as individual tires wore unevenly and had to be replaced. In January 1991, detectives from several area agencies met to create a task force. In July, with no end in sight, a behavioral scientist was brought in to study the crimes and create a profile of the killer. Since serial killers rarely kill outside of their race, the profile described a white male between the ages of 35 and 40. The police profile and other news of the serial killings filled the newspapers. It appeared that the suspect himself was following the report, as the next victim was Tracy O'Donnell, who'd been stabbed, strangled, posed, and mutilated. Though she shared these similarities with most of the other victims, one thing made her unique. She was African American.
That he read in the paper that the serial killer stays within their own race, and yet he went out and found this black prostitute and killed her. It seemed like he did that just to show us that we were wrong, and that perhaps maybe he selects his victims, that he's in control here.
The murderer was maintaining his anonymity, and he was becoming more defiant. By the end of 1991, his victims were being found at the terrifying rate of 1 per month. 19 dead female prostitutes had been discovered, and there would undoubtedly be more. Investigators in Riverside, California, on the trail of a brutal serial killer, finally got a break on January 9th, 1992. An officer patrolling the red light district of Elsinore saw a man speaking to a prostitute from his van. The man drove off, making a right turn without signaling. The officer pulled the van over. The driver's name was William Suff. The officer thought his van fit the description of the vehicle of the suspected serial killer. He noticed the tires were mismatched, and each showed a different wear pattern. William Suff was placed under arrest. His van was impounded at the police station and given a thorough inspection. Police found a gold pillow and a sleeping bag.
Bit of color in the carpet here.
Look.
A blood-stained knife was wedged ominously between the driver's seat and the console. Investigators also found a length of rope, consistent with rope fibers found on the victims. While the knife and other evidence from the van went to the lab, investigators obtained a warrant to search Suff's home. There, they found a worn pair of sneakers that matched prints found near several of the earlier victims. Officers also found Western-style shirts, like the one that had been found on the first victim, and a stack of vehicle maintenance receipts. Back at the lab, DNA tests were performed on the knife found in Suff's van. The results matched the blood of the last victim. William Suff's blood, saliva, and other bodily fluids were tested to establish his DNA profile for comparison to fluid evidence found on some of the victims. In many cases, it was a match. Fiber from the gold pillow and sleeping bag, along with samples of Suff's hair, also matched evidence found at the crime scenes. Tire marks from Suff's van were consistent with imprints photographed at several locations. The vehicle maintenance records were also helpful in establishing when Suff had his tires rotated or changed. Police kept their own records of the tire positions at each crime scene. When they compared Suff's records with their own notes, they found an exact match. Police were able to surmise William Suff's homicidal pattern. He would cruise the red light districts.
Hi. I'm fine. How are you? Doing good. Good. You looking for a date?
When he chose a prostitute, he would invite her into his van and drive to a secluded place. He subdued his victims, tying them so he could torture and rape. Then he killed them, either by stabbing or strangulation. Occasionally, he dressed the victims in articles of his own clothing so he could move them without getting blood in his van. He made no effort to hide the remains. On July 19, 1995, William Suff was convicted of multiple murders. He was sentenced to death 12 times. A serial killer's compulsion for murder never stops. Once he finds a pattern that works, he'll stick with it time and again. But the pattern that provides his success also establishes a trail for those who are sworn to track him down. Investigators on the scene of a drug overdose find themselves matching wits with a serial killer. Something in the water has killed an office worker in Arizona. Her colleagues are lucky to be alive. Now detectives must decipher a mass poisoner's chilling agenda. When a healthy woman is found dead in her bath, investigators know she didn't drown on her own. Chemistry confirms there's more here than meets the eye. But can it lead them to the killer? Our material world is built on just 113 kinds of atoms. Their combinations can produce a world of good, but in the wrong hands, they're just bad medicine. At 10 a.m. on Saturday, December 10th, 1994, Detroit police arrived at the hotel suite of Lowell and Roberta Amos, just 1 block from police headquarters. Lowell had reported that his wife had overdosed on cocaine and was dead. Police found a cocaine straw and playing card in the nightstand, but no signs of the drug. Mr. Amos said he panicked and flushed it when he woke to discover that his wife was dead. To police, it seemed that Amos had done more than dispose of the cocaine. The room was neat as a pin, practically scrubbed clean. The bedding where the victim lay, however, was thoroughly soiled and smeared from side to side.
So how much more you got to work on there?
Though the victim wore no makeup, the pillowcase was saturated with cosmetics. When the medical examiner removed the victim, it was clear that she had been dead several hours before police were notified. Suspicions arose that there was more here than Amos was telling. Homicide was called in, and Lowell Edward Amos gave police his account of what happened that night.
I got it.
Roberta Amos was last seen with her husband in the hotel suite of his business partner, Norbert Crabtree, and his girlfriend, Darcy Smith.
We'll never notice.
Fine, thank you.
The event was the company Christmas party, and executives were given suites at the hotel so they wouldn't have to drive afterward. Though Lowell and Roberta Amos were unofficially separated, she agreed to accompany him to the party. Afterward, Crabtree had invited Lowell and Roberta to his suite to continue celebrating. They stayed until 4:30 a.m. Lowell told police that after they returned to their suite, they made love and started doing cocaine. Lowell fell asleep while Roberta continued using the drug. He said that she had sinus trouble and couldn't snort it, so she found other ways to get it into her system. She must have overdosed while he slept. Because drugs were involved, he was afraid to call the police right away and flushed the remainder. But that didn't adequately explain why he waited so long to call authorities. Swabs taken from the victim's vaginal area tested positive for traces of cocaine. Other than that, There were no other external signs of the drug. That was strange. Internally, she had 14 times more cocaine than is normally seen in an overdose. She died before half of it was broken down. In cocaine poisoning, death is preceded by violent convulsions. Forensic chemist Phyllis Good believed that Amos could not have shared the victim's bed and slept through that. In fact, he probably couldn't have fallen asleep at all.
Well, cocaine is a central nervous system stimulant and has the effect of keeping a person awake and full of energy. It's not the usual case that a person would go to sleep right after they've used cocaine.
Get this sheet off of here, that should be the last thing we need.
Lowell Amos did his best to clean up the scene, but his story of his wife's death just wasn't washing. Now, investigators had to prove that he killed her. At the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, Phyllis Good examined the bedsheet to determine what caused the stains. Nothing in Lowell Amos's scenario could have accounted for their condition. Because the victim's body was so clean, they suspected that Lowell had washed it before he called police. Investigators hoped some evidence remained in the linens. The sheet was treated with chemicals to more clearly reveal the stains. Portions were cut out and labeled. Because the stains occurred on virtually all portions of the sheet, Good took samples from all areas. The same process was repeated with the pillowcase to see if anything besides makeup could be identified. The pattern of the smudges suggested that the pillow wasn't simply wiped across the victim's face.
What appeared to be lipstick, or characterized as lipstick, is that there is an imprint on the pillowcase of what had appeared to be imprint of teeth marks. And they are located in this area under the blue spot. The blue coloration is from laboratory testing.
People at the Christmas party told police that they had seen the victim wearing makeup. When her body was found, she had none, but the pillow revealed she went to bed wearing it. Apparently, she had bitten hard on the pillow, or the pillow had been pushed hard into her face before she died.
Now, once we do
A bruise on her nose suggested that it was pressed with tremendous force. The samples from the pillowcase and sheet were sent to the State Police Crime Lab for analysis. Investigators awaited the results. Meanwhile, police interviewed Norbert Crabtree and a business associate. He admitted that on the day of the death, Lowell Amos had phoned his room at 8:30 a.m. saying he needed help. He wasn't specific. Crabtree, who was awakened by the call, didn't arrive until 9:30 with another business associate. Lowell told them that Roberta was dead and gave them a bag to hold for him. Detective Patrick Hennahan was assigned to the case.
The items were described as a washcloth from the hotel linen that was stained and very foul smelling, a sport coat, and a syringe without a needle in a small leather type carrying case.
Amos collected the items from his friends later. Investigators never recovered them. To determine what happened, they had to rely on the evidence at hand, namely the bedsheet and pillowcase. The lab results showed traces of cocaine throughout the sheet, but that was all.
The results of the tests were the lack of urine or presence of urine, the lack of semen or seminal fluid, and the only thing that was identified in the brown areas was characterized as vegetative matter.
The identity of the brown stains was inconclusive. They shed no light on what happened, only deepening the mystery. The fact that the cocaine was also smeared around the sheet and tucked under the sides merely told investigators what they already knew, that Lowell Amos had manipulated the scene, either out of fear of being blamed for contributing to his wife's death, or to hide the evidence that proved he murdered her. As investigators mulled over which it could be, Lowell Amos's past began to catch up with him. It seemed that Amos may have been a real lady killer. As word spread of the investigation into the death of Roberta Amos, investigators in Detroit learned much about the suspect, Lowell Amos. He had an unsettling history with women. Two came forward who said that before he married Roberta, they met him at a bar, had drinks with him, and woke up in his apartment with no recollection of how they had gotten there. Other women reported becoming violently ill after being intimate with him. They claimed they'd been drugged. But the most astonishing revelations were yet to come.
I began to receive phone calls from relatives, received phone calls from doctors, private investigators, police officers, friends from as far away as Oregon. Most of the information that was coming in was in regards not just to Roberta Maury Amos, but also her husband Lowell Amos. I was advised that this was not his first wife to die at a young age under suspicious circumstances.
None of the deaths were considered criminal at the time, but times had changed, and the death of Roberta Amos shed new light on old events. In 1994, Michigan amended its rules of evidence. Past incidents could now be entered into a current criminal trial. If Amos's dark history could be shown to have some bearing on Roberta's death, the case against him would be the first one tried under the new rules. Nancy Westveld, assistant prosecuting attorney for Wayne County, Michigan, was brought in to see if the rules applied to Lowell Edward Amos.
If somehow we could demonstrate what Mr. Amos's real intentions were by looking back and looking at these other women, looking at their lives, looking at their deaths, looking at how Ed Amos had treated them, and in the end, what he did to them as they died.
The first Mrs. Amos, Sandra Amos, died in 1979 at age 36. The couple had been married 9 years. According to Lowell, Sandra mixed Dalmane, a sedative, with wine and must have collapsed and hit her head on the bathroom counter. Though Sandra's autopsy revealed traces of Dalmane and alcohol in her system, it wasn't enough to incapacitate her. Most of the drug was still in her stomach, undigested. She showed only a small abrasion over her eye, not enough to knock her out or kill her. Her cause of death was undetermined. The circumstances were not suspicious enough to launch an investigation. However, in hindsight, one detail stood out. After Sandra was taken away, a neighbor walked in to find Amos burning something in the fireplace. He told the neighbor it was his wife's clothes, bloodied from her accident. But whatever killed Sandra left no bleeding cuts or lacerations. There was no blood at the scene, and she was taken away in the clothes she was wearing when she died.
So the question became for us, what was Ed burning in the fireplace? And why was it so important that he get it destroyed before anyone saw exactly what it was?
Lowell Edward Amos received $350,000 as beneficiary of his first wife's insurance. Shortly after came wife number 2, Carolyn Amos, Lowell's mistress while he was married to Sandra.
You are irresponsible, no.
Their marriage was rocky. The friction point was the huge insurance policies Lowell kept taking out on his new wife. When he would not drop these policies in 1988, Carolyn threw him out of the house. he went to live with his mother, Mary Tolles, age 76. He stayed with her approximately 2 weeks when she became ill and was brought to the emergency room. Her doctor commented that it appeared as though she was drugged, but none of the medications prescribed to her could account for her disorientation. At the hospital, she began to recover and was sent home. Carolyn Amos phoned Mary Tolles every day to check up on her. A few weeks after Tolles returned from the hospital, Carolyn's call was answered by Lowell, who had just discovered that his mother was dead, apparently for several hours. Carolyn raced over to the house with a friend to find Lowell packing his belongings into his car. He didn't want anyone to know he was living there. Lowell inherited more than $1 million from his mother's estate. No autopsy was performed on Mary Tolles because of her age. Carolyn let Lowell move back into the house. 9 months later, in the spring of 1989, Carolyn, too, was dead. According to Lowell's report to police, he brought Carolyn a glass of wine while she was in the bathroom blow-drying her hair. When he went to check on her later, he found her dead on the bathroom floor, eerily like his first wife. It took a while for medical assistants to arrive at their secluded house. By then, it was too late to revive her. Amos suggested that she may have been electrocuted from the blow dryer. An examination of the cord showed that it had been cut, but Carolyn wasn't electrocuted. Her cause of death was never determined. Though the case was never pursued, the medical crew found inconsistencies at the scene. The wine glass was missing, found later rinsed and in the dishwasher, and the position of the victim's body suggested that she had been moved.
Her pajama top and her pajama pants were up at the ends, both at the bottoms of her feet as well as at her waist, hitched up, as it were, as if she had been moved. Certainly not in a position they would have been if she had crumpled to the floor.
Lowell received $800,000 from his second wife's insurance policies. For investigators, Lowell Amos was the kiss of death to the women he purportedly loved. Detective Hennehan believed it had to be more than coincidence.
I have had 3 close relatives of mine that have died. I've never been within 500 miles of any one of them when they died. Lowell Amos was in the company of all 4 of these persons when they died. He benefited emotionally and financially from their deaths.
Like the other deaths, Roberta Amos lay dead for some time before authorities were notified.
Ed wanted to make sure that each of these women was beyond help. He wanted to make sure none could be resuscitated, none could be medically brought back to life, because he wanted all of these women dead.
Though Roberta Amos's marriage was failing, she enjoyed a measure of professional success. Shortly before her death, she had purchased a house with her own money. Her plan was to legally end her marriage to Lowell and make a fresh start. Though Lowell Edward Amos had no financial stake in her death, investigators believed that he couldn't stand the idea that she had rejected him. The similarities between the death of Roberta Amos and Lowell's other wives was enough to expose him as an opportunistic serial killer who murdered for money or just to end an inconvenient marriage. Based on the collected evidence, and the ghosts from his past, authorities had what they needed to arrest him for the murder of his third wife, Roberta Amos.
From the photographs of that night, Roberta Maury Amos looked happy. She looked like she was having a good time. She must have had hope for the future then. She shouldn't have.
At trial, the prosecution presented an account of the last night of Roberta Amos's life. After leaving Norbert Crabtree's suite, the couple went to their own room, where Lowell dissolved a large quantity of cocaine in water. He was somehow able to incapacitate the victim. Once she was subdued, he used a syringe to administer the lethal dose of cocaine. Then, perhaps as she was convulsing, he smothered her with the pillow. He then scrubbed the body and cleaned up the crime scene as best he could before calling Crabtree to dispose of the remaining evidence. For his crime, Lowell Edward Amos was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lowell Amos escaped suspicion through the subtlety of his crimes. But his past and forensics caught up with him at last. Other killers are more obvious in their methods, though they may be just as difficult to catch. Monday, March 24th, 1986, started out like any other Monday. By 8:30 a.m., the employees at the Transamerica Title Insurance Company in Tempe, Arizona, were already at the office. Their weekends a fading memory. Like her co-workers, 46-year-old Julie Ann Williams eased into the day with a trip to the break room. The coffee was on, but she preferred a drink of cool water. Just one sip told her something wasn't right.
Should I come with you?
She immediately didn't feel well and headed to the ladies' room. She didn't know it, but she was beyond help. When Julie Williams was found in the ladies' room shortly before 9 a.m., she was in cardiac arrest. By the time paramedics arrived, she had slipped into a coma. They rushed her to the hospital. Something was in the water. While the co-workers discussed what had happened, one of them, Diane Harry, was on the phone to her husband. She was more concerned than the rest because something similar happened to her just a few days before. By the time police arrived to investigate, Diane Harry's husband, Louis Harry, was already there, looking for what might have poisoned the water.
You take care, okay?
But it wasn't just the cooler that was tainted. Tempe Police Sergeant Mike Palmer led the investigation.
I detected an odor within the room. Upon examining almost every cup or container of any type and the coffee pot that was in there, I could see that there was some type of substance in almost all of them. At that point, we decided that someone had purposely placed whatever this material was in these containers in order to injure people.
The office workers were lucky that no one else was hurt. But Julie Williams, after lingering in a coma, was not so fortunate. Whoever spread poison in the break room was now a murderer. Samples of the unknown poison were taken for identification. Police dusted for fingerprints, but no suspicious ones turned up.
we're only going to have it for a short while. If you wouldn't mind turning
The police interviewed the office workers. Diane Harry told detectives that on the previous Friday, she became ill after taking a sip of scotch at home. That Saturday, a cup of tea affected her the same way.
She remained ill the entire weekend. She barely could get out of bed. And she told me that the smell of the substance that she had inside her house in Phoenix was pretty much the same as the smell that was in the substance that was in the break room.
Questions as far as what happened with her.
She was concerned that she was the poisoner's target, which is why she called her husband to the office when Julianne Williams became ill.
I'm sorry.
Police talked to Louis Harry. He too was worried that someone was trying to poison Diane Harry. He said he'd been receiving threatening letters from the abusive boyfriend of a woman he'd helped. Perhaps this was his revenge. Louis was sent home to collect the letters, along with the scotch bottle and tea kettle, so they could be analyzed.
We'll certainly let you know.
Meantime, police collected the security cards that every employee needed to enter the building. Investigators suspected that whoever planted the poison did it sometime during the weekend. A check with the security company showed that only one security card had been used that weekend, at 10:18 on Saturday morning. It belonged to Diane Harry.
When I confronted Mrs. Harry about her card being the only one used during the weekend, she denied having used it. The only thing she could tell me was that she did not know where it was at, other than the fact it should have been in her purse, because that's where she'd placed it the last time she'd used it.
Mr. Harry, I just have a couple of questions.
The card was in fact in her purse Monday morning when she went to work. She insisted she'd been bedridden all weekend and never left the house.
It says that you checked into your office.
So far, all the evidence pointed to Diane Harry. But was she the prime suspect or the intended victim? It was too soon to tell. While detectives were trying to identify the criminal, scientists were trying to name their poison. Samples from the office water cooler, coffee creamer, and sugar bowl, along with the tea kettle and scotch bottle from the Harry's house, were brought to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, where they were analyzed by Supervisor Jim Timmons. He knew that the poison was a fast-acting white powder. That helped him narrow down his tests.
I really came up with a pretty short list of poisons that could have resulted in the information that I had heard about the case. And the short list was arsenic, strychnine, or cyanide.
Investigators applied a series of tests to the compound to narrow the list even further and to check and double-check his results. An ultraviolet light was shown through a solution of the unknown substance and measured on an apparatus called a spectrophotometer. Strychnine, which absorbs UV light, would give a reading. Arsenic and cyanide, which reflect UV, wouldn't register. The unknown substance gave a reading on the spectrophotometer, proving it wasn't strychnine. They then performed a test for arsenic. Samples of the substance were dissolved in acid, and a copper wire was placed in the resulting solution. If arsenic were present, it would attach to the wire and turn it black. No arsenic was present. The unknown poison in the office and in the Harry's home was most likely cyanide. To be certain, Timmons used a commercial kit for identifying cyanide.
It's actually a very simple test, but it involves some pretty complex chemical reactions. Ultimately, what happens is a red dye is formed if you have cyanide, and you test this on a paper strip that you drop into a solution. And in this case, it was positive, indicating cyanide was present.
To remove all shadow of doubt, Timmons further confirmed his results with a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. The substance was sealed in a test tube of acid. If it was truly cyanide, it would form hydrogen cyanide gas, like a mini gas chamber. The gas was drawn off and injected into the apparatus, which confirmed that the cyanide gas was created. The battery of tests would provide essential forensic evidence for the courtroom if the poisoner was ever brought to trial. Timmons was not done yet. Cyanide most commonly appears in two forms, sodium cyanide and potassium cyanide. Both are equally lethal. A technique called energy dispersive X-ray analysis allowed him to simultaneously check for various elements in the compound. He found potassium. Samples from the office and from the Harry's home gave identical results. Both were potassium cyanide. The water cooler alone had enough cyanide to kill 150 people. The killer had set his or her traps in both places and cast a wide net to catch one victim. Diane Harry was either lucky to be alive or trying to disguise her role as the poisoner. The questioning continued.
I questioned Miss Harry about her husband's ability to get her electronic card that allowed access to the building, and she stated that he could have, but as far as she knew, it was in her purse. She indicated to me that she was not sure where he had been on that Saturday morning from approximately 9 in the morning until 12:30.
If Diane truly didn't use her security card on Saturday, perhaps her husband did. He was the only other person who would have had access to it. He said he was running errands that day. He couldn't account for his exact whereabouts at the time the card was used to enter the building. He insisted that the killer was the jealous boyfriend of the woman whom he had helped. He had the threatening letters to prove it. While the documents were being examined, investigators looked further into Louis Harry's movements. Their quest took them to a convenience store across the street from his wife's office building.
We were able to find an individual who actually observed a black male subject driving a blue sports car, which is what Mr. Harry drove, enter at the approximate time that his wife, Diane Harry's key card was used to open the door to the business.
That gave investigators the leverage they needed to serve a search warrant on Louis Harry's office. He worked in the athletics department of a community college. In the wastebasket, detectives found a label from a chemical supplier, some white powder on a bookshelf, and a small plastic knife, also speckled with powder that was later identified as cyanide.
Okay.
The cyanide found in his office didn't prove he put it there. A defense lawyer could argue that whoever tried to poison his wife also left cyanide at Louis's office. But the next discovery would be much more difficult to explain away.
Also, there was a legal pad that we found that had the handwritten version of the threatening letters that had been mailed to him, the last few of the threatening letters.
The pad and a box of envelopes were brought to the Department of Public Safety, where they were analyzed by forensic document examiner Bill Flynn.
In many ways, handwriting is even more individualistic or individualizing than DNA for this reason. There are groups of people in society like monozygotal twins or identical twins who do in fact have identical DNA characteristics. However, in forensic handwriting identification, we've never found any two people that have exactly identical handwriting characteristics.
The handwriting on the letters was compared to samples of Louis Harry's writing taken from business forms at his office and at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Flynn was able to say that Harry had actually written the drafts of the two threatening letters he claimed were sent to him. After he perfected his wording longhand, he typed the letters and mailed them. An analysis of the envelopes proved it. The letters that Harry presented to police were sent in slightly defective envelopes. The unused envelopes in the box confiscated at Harry's office bore similar flaws. Flynn exploited that weakness to strengthen his case.
A defect of the type that we had seen in that envelope was actually rare. The reason it was rare is that it would be severe enough to shut down the line. They would actually have to clear the envelope-making line and restart it in order to clear that type of error.
For Lewis Harry, the defective envelopes were especially incriminating. But they didn't seal his fate. Forensics had proved only that he'd sent himself the threatening letters. Now it had to prove he'd carried out his poisoned promises. To tie Lewis Harry to the poisoning of his wife's office, detectives needed to prove that he'd purchased the cyanide. They went to the chemical company listed on the label found in his office and obtained their sales records. The clerk recalled selling potassium cyanide to an African-American male. On the receipt, the name was Charles Holly. An African-American man named Charles Holly was contacted. He told police he'd never purchased cyanide. His signature wasn't close to the one on the receipt. Lewis Harry was asked to give a handwriting sample.
We asked Lewis Harry to write the name Charles Holly. He did do that. And from the earlier writings that I had in my office, and now with the new exemplars, I was able to identify Lewis Harry as actually writing the name.
That was all detectives needed to make their case against Lewis Harry. According to the prosecution's scenario, Lewis Harry did receive threatening letters from the ex-boyfriend of the woman who was secretly Harry's new lover. The letters gave Harry the idea to write his own, more threatening letters and send them to himself, implicating the ex-boyfriend. He practiced his poison pen letters before typing them. When his attempts to poison Diane Harry at home didn't work, he secretly borrowed her security card, sneaked into her office, and poisoned everything he could find in the break room. He was a frequent visitor to his wife's office, so his fingerprints weren't suspicious. But when his wife called him after Julianne Williams was poisoned, he wasted no time coming to the office to leave even more prints while pretending to show concern. Diane Harry's trust in her husband was steadfast to the end. Throughout the investigation, she refused to believe that he could be the poisoner. Though she remained unconvinced by the evidence, the jury saw it another way. For the murder of Julianne Williams, Lewis Harry was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder, plus 105 more years for attempted murder. He's serving at least 95 years. Even after Lewis Harry's conviction, Diane Harry swore that he was a victim of circumstance. Her feelings changed a year later when her brother uncovered the box of cyanide hidden in the Harry's attic. For every criminal who thinks he's committed the perfect murder, there's a team of dedicated investigators out to prove him wrong. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, on the morning of March 28, 1990, 6-year-old James Woodward called his dad because he couldn't find his mother. The Woodwards had been separated for 3 months. David Woodward told his son to go to the neighbor for help. The boy told the neighbor that he thought his mother was locked in the bathroom, but he couldn't hear any sounds inside. She followed James to the bathroom.
She's in here, she's in here. Go call 911, quick.
She jimmied the lock and found 30-year-old Deborah Woodward submerged in the tub. An odor like solvent hung in the air. The paramedics and deputy medical examiner arrived to study the scene. The victim showed no contusions or abrasions to suggest that she slipped in the tub.
Probably get a print of
There was
that.
nothing to indicate why she may have drowned. And there was no explaining the odor permeating the room. According to forensic pathologist Sparks Veazey, the situation was peculiar from the start.
A normal, healthy adult generally does not just drown in 4, 5, 6 inches of water in a bathtub. We look for some explanation for that.
At autopsy, blood was drawn and screened for alcohol, which might have contributed to the drowning. While a body is wet, injuries may be obscured, but as it dries, more is disclosed. As the examination continued, a chilling revelation sprang from the victim's own lips.
The examination of the inside of the lips showed injuries inside the lips, which were suggestive that something had been forcefully placed over the decedent's mouth and pressed into the teeth, causing injuries of the inside of the lips.
The case was looking more like homicide by the minute. The blood work showed no alcohol in the victim's system, but it did reveal a volatile substance similar to acetone, or nail polish remover. A sample of the blood was placed in a gas chromatograph to better identify the substance. It turned out to be ether. In fact, every tissue in the victim's body was saturated with it. Ether is a volatile liquid that can depress the central nervous system. Depending on how much is inhaled, it can cause dizziness, unconsciousness, or death by respiratory failure. It was once a common form of medical anesthesia, but was replaced by more predictable and safer methods. Ether can be produced in the body by the breakdown of some other chemicals or drugs the victim might have taken. Chief toxicologist Ronald Backer didn't believe this was the case.
But the fact that it was distributed in all tissues and in very high concentrations was a good indication that this was a significant substance that was not an artifact that really was involved in rendering her unconscious.
The victim had enough ether in her system to knock her out, but it was the drowning that did her in. This was no accident. While investigating the suspicious death of Deborah Woodward, police learned that she was separated from her husband, David. Even so, she shared her house with him until it could be sold. In an unconventional timeshare arrangement, their 3 sons stayed at the house while Deborah and David took turns living there and sharing child custody. The plan was designed to create some stability for the boys, but the friction between the couple lay just below the surface. Deborah had a restraining order preventing her husband from approaching the house while it was her turn to live there. None of the couple's problems escaped the scrutiny of Albuquerque police detective Damon Fay, who was investigating Deborah Woodward's murder.
So now I had to explore every part of her life, and I had to just open up all of the canisters of her life. One of them was her diary, particularly ghoulish to read because I could see the buildup of heading towards marriage with David, all of her excitement that goes along with that, the new marriage, the early years of it, then the deterioration of it.
In her diaries, which Deborah entrusted to a friend for safekeeping, she recounted the physical and emotional abuse that she endured.
Dave slapped me around in the bathroom, messed up my clothes, broke things. So much anger. Hell, absolute hell.
After the separation, Deborah tried to get on with her life. She began dating and was starting a serious relationship. But her husband was jealous, and she was fearful of what he might do. According to investigator Fay, she counted on her neighbor, a retired police sergeant, to keep an eye out for her, especially at night.
And had actually come to the rescue of Deborah on several occasions where she felt David had been skulking around, or she heard bumps in the night and wanted him to sort of investigate it. He would walk across the street and take care of things, walk around her house on occasion. So he had sort of passing knowledge about the domestic turbulence.
The neighbor told police that 6 months earlier, Deborah had noticed something odd in her car. He offered to take a look and discovered that David, an electronics expert at a garage, had planted a tape recorder in her car that switched on whenever the engine started. He'd also bugged the house and telephone lines.
There was nowhere in the house where she couldn't go that he could overhear whatever conversation was taking place. He could then take these tapes away and dissect them, go back through them, listen to them, and that would just infuriate him.
David was doing everything in his power to keep tabs on his wife, while Deborah devoted all her strength to making a clean break. It was a rough game of tug-of-war, and it looked like something had finally snapped. The neighbor told police that several days before the murder, he saw David Woodward dismantling the motion sensor spotlights he'd recently installed around the perimeter of the house. He thought nothing of it at the time. Now, it seemed too convenient. Woodward had the motive and opportunity to kill his wife, but where was the weapon? Though ether was obviously used to incapacitate the victim, it was the impurities in it that drew the focus of investigators. The killer had used impure industrial-grade ether, like the kind used in carburetor starting fluid. Considering that David worked in a garage, that seemed a likely source. If they could link him to a brand of starting fluid with the same contaminants in it, they'd be that much closer to closing the case. They tested every can they could find, with no matches.
Hey man, I was watching the show the other night.
As investigators were busy tracking down the ether, one of Woodward's co-workers contacted police.
Oh man, there's so many ways.
He told them that a year earlier, Woodward had
ever
talked
know.
about getting away with murder by using a volatile substance, like ether. Woodward claimed it would be untraceable. He was very detailed about it, but the co-worker wasn't paying close
It knocks
attention.
people out. And what you do is you spray it on like a rag and you put it over their face.
Based on this lead and the other circumstantial evidence gathered at this point, police obtained a warrant to search the garage.
How long did you stay there?
They confiscated an assortment of chemicals, including more cans of carburetor starting fluid.
We never did find any brand that was perfect, but we found some that were very close and ones that we could put a star next to as the possible source of the ether in the Deborah Woodward blood sample.
But in terms of evidence, it was enough. David Woodward was arrested. Based on the evidence, police reconstructed the murder of Deborah Woodward. It was the victim's habit to take a late-night soak after putting the children to sleep. While she was getting ready for her bath, David used his key to enter the house. He had already dismantled the motion sensors so he could sneak into the yard under cover of darkness. Once in the house, he saturated a rag with starting fluid, overpowered his wife, and caused the marks seen at autopsy. As the victim lay unconscious, David pushed her head below the water. He thought the ether would evaporate, and with it would go all evidence of a crime.
The truth of the matter is that dead men tell plenty of tales if you have a competent team of forensic investigators, which include the police at the scene, the autopsy people taking the samples, and the laboratory that analyzes the samples.
David Woodward received life in prison for murder and an additional 9 years for aggravated burglary for entering the home and battering his wife. No poison is perfect. The clearest liquid or finest powder still leaves behind its residue. And though the victim may at first appear unmarked, science can reveal how death was dispensed and dispense justice to the poisoner. In Hawaii, investigators find a body inside a makeshift coffin. But to find the killer, they must first rely on insects to help them identify the victim. A body is discovered under a pile of curbside trash in Oklahoma. Though police identify a suspect, it falls to a bug expert to prove murder. In Mississippi, a young family is found brutally murdered in a rural home. To expose a killer's guilt, examiners must find a way to establish when they died. When a killer leaves no trace of himself at a crime scene, investigators can turn to the insects left behind for answers. Forensic entomologists can find justice for the victims of homicide by following the trails of predators and parasites. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. On October 24th, 1994, a man driving along the old Cali Highway in Oahu, Hawaii, noticed something lying in the woods just off the road. As he approached the object, he realized it was a large toolbox. Curious as to what he had found, he pried the box open. Inside were the badly decomposed remains of a human body. He called 911. Officers and forensic technicians from the Honolulu Police Department responded to the scene. Blunt force trauma on the skull indicated this individual had been murdered. No form of identification was located near the male victim's remains. Hundreds of insects were found in and around the makeshift coffin. Having found little evidence to tell them who this victim was or when he had been murdered, investigators contacted renowned forensic entomologist Dr. Lee Goff. As an expert in insect growth and development, Dr. Goff analyzes bugs found on a corpse and estimates how much time has elapsed since a person's death. In the toolbox, he found over 250 species of insects, including a colony of long-legged ants that had nested inside the victim's skull. After collecting dozens of samples, he returned to his lab at the University of Hawaii. An examination of the skeletal remains revealed that the male victim was between 50 and 60 years of age and approximately 6 feet tall. Damage to the skull was consistent with injuries caused by massive blunt force trauma. Other than observing that the victim had extensive bridge work done on his teeth, no other identifying features were found. Investigators began searching through previously filed missing persons reports, looking for a match with their victim. Though there were a few potential matches, homicide detective Hal Fitchett knew that until they could be certain of the man's identity, solving this case would be nearly impossible.
In all homicide cases, you've got to make identification of the body or skeletal remains in any case to make it solid for a jury to understand that this was a victim and this is how he died and this is who he was and how it happened.
In order to firmly establish the male victim's identity, investigators first needed to determine when he died. Dr. Lee Goff believed that the insects found in the makeshift coffin held the answers.
Typically, what we look at are life cycles of individual insects or succession patterns of insects onto the body. As the first fly lays its egg and starts the clock, the eggs hatch, the maggots begin to feed on the body, they change the body. And as they do this, they make the body attractive to yet another group of insects, and you have successive waves of insects invading this particular body, each one utilizing a different part of the body.
Among the various insects found, Dr. Goff identified the black soldier fly. Entomological research has shown that the black soldier fly will not become attracted to a body until decomposition has been underway for at least 30 days. But Dr. Goff also located newly hatched fly larvae, or maggots, that had come from the black soldier fly. Knowing it takes an additional 60 days from the time the soldier fly arrives to the time its eggs hatch and begin to mature into adults, he concluded that the victim had been deceased for at least 90 days. But the presence of the ant colony inside the skull indicated the victim had been dead much longer.
The ants were there basically looking for a somewhat dry place in which to establish their colony. They were looking at a protected type of an environment, a good place to establish the colony. And they're primarily just as a shelter, as opposed to using the body as a food source.
To determine when this victim died, Dr. Goff now needed to determine how long the ant colony had been present inside the toolbox. He began research into how ant colonies grow and develop.
You're going to find several different forms that are going to be present within the colony, each one doing a different job. Initially, you're just producing workers, servicing the queen, making sure the colony is maintained, obtaining food. But then you reach a certain colony size. At that point, this colony is large enough that they want to look at establishing other colonies.
Generally, a colony reaches that size in 12 months. Then the queen begins producing other reproductive ants. Dr. Goff found such ants, identifiable by their wings, which allow them to leave the colony and go on to form their own. Knowing that the ants had not arrived until the soldier fly larvae began to hatch, Dr. Goff estimated that the victim had been dead about 15 months. But then, he factored in additional time it would have taken for the insects to penetrate the toolbox. Ultimately, he estimated the victim died 18 months before his body was discovered. Using Dr. Goff's analysis, investigators were quickly able to identify a missing persons report filed 18 months earlier that closely matched their victim's description. They contacted the man's family members.
It's kind of a trying time for you, but I wonder...
The children told police that their father, 55-year-old Charles Osborne, had disappeared in April 1993. They had last spoken with him on the phone shortly before he disappeared. Charles, a father of 3, was the co-owner of a marble and tile installation business. He was described as a dedicated craftsman who took great pride in his business and the quality of his work. The family didn't believe he would have just walked away from his livelihood. Co-workers said that they last saw him at a job site in Waikiki, where he was in the process of remodeling condominiums. Photographs of Charles Osborne were handed over to police. Looking to verify that the victim found in the toolbox was in fact Charles Osborne, investigators forwarded the photograph and the skull to the nearby United States Army Central Identification Laboratory. There, forensic anthropologists have spent years trying to match human remains found around the world to military personnel who have been classified as missing in action since the Second World War. To identify the remains, Dr. Robert Mann uses a process called video superimposition. Using photographs of a missing serviceman, examiners use video cameras to generate an image of the face. The image is then projected onto a monitor. Then, the face is superimposed onto a video image of the unidentified skull. Guided by the spatial arrangements that make each person's face unique, examiners look to see if the bone structures line up with the contours of the face in the photograph.
You take the skull that is recovered from a site, and then you take a photograph of the individual who you think it could be. And using 2 different cameras, you overlay those images, and you match up the bony landmarks beneath the skin with the features that you see above in the skin overlying the bone.
Using photographs of the skull found in the toolbox and pictures of Charles Osborne, examiners looked for similarities. Using the extensive dental work as their guide, examiners found a perfect match with the suspected victim. The man found murdered inside the toolbox had been positively identified as Charles Osborne. Now, investigators needed to find out who had put him there and why. By analyzing the insects recovered from a crime scene, forensic entomologist Dr. Lee Goff had helped authorities identify decomposed human remains. "55-year-old contractor Charles Osborne had been murdered 18 months before and his body hidden inside a toolbox. Now, police in Honolulu, Hawaii struggled to identify his killer. Looking to retrace the victim's movements prior to his death, investigators tracked down other contractors who worked with Osborne around the time he disappeared.
I'd like to talk a little bit about
They recalled that the last time they saw him, he had gotten into a heated argument with his business partner. While working to remodel condominiums in Waikiki, his partner and longtime friend Ross Horton said he needed more money to finish the job. Osborne refused. In fact, he accused Horton of using company money to purchase drugs. Ross Horton denied the accusation and then stormed off the job site. When they returned to the condos the following day, there was no sign of Charles Osborne. However, they noticed a pool of reddish-brown liquid on the floor. Believing it to be some sort of cleaning solution, they thought nothing of it. The construction workers agreed to accompany investigators to the former job site in Waikiki. Though nearly 2 years had passed, they hoped to uncover evidence of murder. Criminalists began searching the residence. Though the floors had been tiled over and the walls painted, technicians managed to locate a few minute traces of what appeared to be human blood. The samples were collected and sent on for a more detailed analysis.
That's just where they failed to clean it
In the lab, examiners compared the genetic profile of the blood found in the apartment to known samples of the victim. They matched. Something violent had happened to Charles Osborne inside that condo.
He doesn't just notify the people that carries
And for homicide detective Hal Fitchett, all of the circumstantial evidence pointed to Ross Horton.
So now the objective was to locate Ross Horton. And we contacted individuals here with the state of Hawaii, and they were able to give us possible or potential addresses where Mr. Horton may be residing. So I did follow up with those areas, and I did locate an address.
Ross Horton was ultimately tracked down to an address in Oakland, California. Police there were notified, and when Horton showed up for work, he was taken into custody. Honolulu detectives traveled to California to interview the suspect. Horton was shocked that after so much time, police were able to identify Charles Osborne's remains.
We've got the evidence. Why don't you start writing?
Confronted with the evidence against him, Horton confessed to the murder. Horton said that after the other contractors had left the job site the day he and Osborne argued, he returned to confront his partner. He needed money to buy drugs. But when Osborne refused to give him more company money, he became enraged. The confrontation escalated into a fight, which quickly spiraled out of control. Later that evening, to conceal his crime, Horton placed Charles Osborne's body inside his toolbox and disposed of it off the side of a highway. A jury found Ross Horton guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison. With the help of Dr. Lee Goff's insect analysis, authorities were able to identify the victim and his killer. In Oklahoma, investigators must also rely on bugs, but this time to disprove a murder suspect's alibi. On the morning of August 8, 1993, in the small town of Stroud, Oklahoma, a resident on her way to work suddenly became overwhelmed by a foul odor. It was coming from a large pile of trash in front of her neighbor's home. She examined the garbage, concerned about a potential health hazard. Then she noticed a human hand protruding from the debris. She quickly called 911. Dispatchers learned that the residence where the body was found belonged to 44-year-old Lito Cisneros and his wife, Linda Howell. When police arrived, they began rummaging through the trash. Under the mountain of debris, wrapped in a blanket, investigators found the lifeless body of a middle-aged man. From cuts and bloodstains on his t-shirt, it was clear he had been stabbed to death. Technicians collected all of the garbage, including fly larvae that had covered the body. Neighbors confirmed that the victim was in fact Lito Cisneros. And they hadn't seen his wife, Linda Howell, or Lito's vehicle in some time. Fearing there could be more victims inside, investigators cautiously made their way into the house. No one, including the victim's wife, appeared to be home. Agent Jackie Johnson of the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation worked the case.
When we entered the house and we couldn't locate Linda, who we had been told also lived there, we were very concerned for her welfare because the car had been missing, so we were also afraid that she was a victim.
Their fears appeared to be well-founded. In the kitchen, there were signs that a violent struggle had taken place. Technicians found blood spatter on the wall and floorboards. And hidden beneath the refrigerator, investigators located a steak knife. The evidence was collected and sent to the crime lab for processing. Oklahoma authorities were faced with a dead body and a missing woman. An APB was immediately put out on Lito's vehicle. Investigators knew that if they didn't come up with answers, and quickly, more victims could turn up. Authorities in Stroud, Oklahoma, had few clues in the murder of 44-year-old Lito Cisneros, whose body was found under a pile of trash in front of his home. With the victim's wife and the couple's vehicle unaccounted for, authorities struggled for answers. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Lito Cisneros had died as a result of multiple stab wounds to the head and chest. A knife with a 5/8 of an inch wide blade had caused the fatal injuries. The level of decomposition indicated that Lito had been dead a few days. But with the additional insect activity, it was difficult to pinpoint a specific time of death. Further examination failed to yield any clues to the killer's identity. Police turned to forensic examiners at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation's crime lab. There, examiners scrutinized the knife found hidden under the victim's refrigerator for clues. The blade measured 5/8 of an inch wide, the same dimension as the weapon that caused the fatal injuries. But technicians could find no traces of blood on the blade. The handle had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Desperate to generate a lead, investigators began interviewing local residents. One recalled seeing Lito at a bar on Thursday, August 4th, 4 days before his body was found. And she said he wasn't alone. According to the witness, Lito and his wife Linda Howell got into a heated argument, and that was not unusual. Linda began screaming at her husband, humiliating him in front of the other patrons. The witness also overheard Linda threatening to kill Lito before she stormed out of the bar. Lito followed her out and never returned. The witness had not seen Lito since that night. But she had seen Linda Howell heading out of town in Lito's car a few days later.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Suddenly, investigators were no longer concerned that the victim's wife was in any kind of danger. Agent Jackie Johnson.
We found that Linda had been seen 2 or 3 days following Lito's last sighting, and therefore we were aware that she was okay. And she had also been seen in Lito's car. The fact that she had left town made us suspicious that she might have been involved.
But efforts to locate her and the missing vehicle had been unsuccessful.
Yeah, about a half hour.
Then, a week later, a farmer in a nearby county found an abandoned vehicle parked on his property. A check on the license plates revealed that it belonged to Lito Cisneros. And according to the farmer, it had only been there a day. Linda Howell had to be close by. Within hours, authorities learned that Linda had friends that lived close to where the vehicle had been abandoned. The area was put under surveillance. A short while later, the tactic paid off. Police spotted a car passing through the small town. And sitting in the passenger seat was a woman fitting Linda Howell's description. When questioned, the woman identified herself as Linda Howell. She was taken into custody and then transported back to Stroud, Oklahoma. When questioned, Linda admitted that she and Lito had gotten into a fight at the bar on Thursday evening, August 4th. But she claimed she and Lito had made up by the following morning. In fact, things were going well between them. But on Saturday, August 6th, her ex-husband, Lucky Lee Lancaster, showed up at their house unexpectedly. Lancaster wanted to get back together with his ex-wife.
I didn't hear anything, and so I believed him.
When the two men began to argue, Linda took off. When she returned a short while later, Lucky was standing in the kitchen, holding a bloody knife. He had killed Lito during the fight. Linda Howell was placed under arrest for her role in covering up the murder.
If you decide to answer questions now without your lawyer being present, you have the right to
She believed that after the murder, her ex-husband returned home to California.
any further questions. Understand?
We contacted Lucky's parents, and they were very accommodating and giving us an address where we could contact Lucky in California. We contacted the California officials, and they located him on the beach and actually brought him in for us to speak with.
Authorities traveled to San Clemente, California to speak with the suspect. They learned that for the past several months, Lucky had been living in a homeless shelter. Under questioning, he insisted he had not spoken to Linda Howell in more than a year and denied that he was recently in Oklahoma. A review of the shelter's records corroborated his statements.
He would sign in for his food every day and show an identification. And by checking those records, we were able to establish that he had been in California 6 to 7 months and had not left California prior to the homicide.
That meant Linda Howell's story was a lie. Now she explained her marriage to Lito was rocky, and without an alibi, she knew she would be blamed for her husband's death. She said the last time she saw Lito was on Saturday morning, August 6th, when he left town to visit some friends. When he hadn't returned by the following day, she decided to visit friends of her own in a nearby county. It seemed someone was trying to frame her for the murder. Investigators weren't buying the story. To prove that Linda had killed her husband, investigators needed to establish that Lito was already dead on August 6th, the day Linda claimed she last saw her husband alive. The only evidence authorities had to firmly establish a time of death were the insects collected from the victim's body. The bugs were sent to forensic entomologist Dr. Neil Haskell, a professor at St. Joseph's University in Rensselaer, Indiana.
The Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation investigator, Jackie Johnson, had collected entomological evidence, primarily maggots, from the decedent's body. We can use those maggots, larvae of a particular species of fly, to estimate how long the body's been there based on their growth and development of these insect life stages.
Dr. Haskell has spent the last 18 years researching the relationship between insects and decomposing human remains. To understand that relationship and to determine the life cycles of insects on a corpse, most of his studies have been done using pigs that have died of natural causes.
Pigs are readily available anywhere in the world, and many of the pig organs and tissues are almost identical to the human organs and tissues. So we find that it is a very adequate model to, and probably the closest animal we can find, and we find relatively no difference in the rate of decomposition of humans and pigs, nor do we find any difference in the insects or the sequence of insects that are attracted to both humans and pigs.
Based on those studies, Dr. Haskell concluded that the common blowfly larvae collected from the crime scene were in the 3rd stage of development, meaning they were very close to becoming adult flies. But to determine how long it took them to reach that stage, Dr. Haskell consulted the weather data for the days leading up to the discovery of the body. Heat speeds up the development process. Cold slows it down. He found it hadn't been warm enough from August 6th to August 8th to account for the advanced stage of development. That meant Lito could not have died on August 6th, as Linda had claimed. His death likely occurred more than 90 hours before he was discovered, which would put the murder in the late evening hours of Thursday, August 4th, the night Lito and Linda fought at the bar.
Entomologically, this was very easy to prove because we had fully mature 3rd stage maggots and we had the temperatures available for their growth and development, and it was very consistent with more of a 96-hour interval time of death rather than the 36-hour interval. And so we could refute the 36-hour interval as not being true, and we went with the 96-hour interval, which was consistent with her being with her husband, the decedent, at that time, and him dying shortly after she was with him.
Dr. Haskell contacted Agent Johnson with his findings. Linda Howell was subsequently charged with murder. Police believe that after arriving home from the bar on Thursday evening, August 4th, the fight between Linda Howell and Lito Cisneros escalated. After stabbing him to death, Linda dragged his body to the curb, covered him with debris, and left him with the garbage to be picked up in a few days. Based on Dr. Haskell's analysis, Linda Howell pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. An hour's drive from the Mississippi state capital of Jackson, the rural community of Summit offers an escape from bustling city life. It's a sleepy little town, and in 1993, it seemed an ideal place for one family to spend some quality time together. On the evening of December 16th, police received a frantic 911 call. A man reported that he had discovered his family dead inside his remote vacation home. Officers from the Pike County Sheriff's Office and from the Mississippi Highway Patrol were dispatched to the scene.
Yeah,
50-year-old Michael Rubenstein told the officers that when he hadn't heard from his 24-year-old stepson, Darrell Perry, in some time, he drove from his Louisiana home to check on him. When he entered the residence, Michael found Darrell and Darrell's 22-year-old wife, Annie, dead. Annie's 4-year-old daughter, Crystal, was also dead. When detectives made their way into the residence, they were immediately struck by the smell of natural gas. In the living room, police found the badly decomposed bodies of Darrell and Annie Perry. In an adjacent bedroom, police found the lifeless body of Crystal lying in her bed. Police removed the bodies and sent them for autopsy. The following day, investigators from the Mississippi Highway Patrol began looking for clues to explain the deaths. Aside from the smell of natural gas, Detective Alan Applewhite was left with few answers.
Due to the state of decomposition, there was no way that we could determine the cause of death. The room was not disturbed in any means. It didn't look like there'd been a struggle. We had 2 victims in the den area with nothing out of place.
Police turned to the medical examiner for answers. The level of decay and the development stage of insects observed on the bodies suggested the family had been dead at least 2 weeks. That meant they had likely died in early December. Believing a gas leak inside the residence was responsible for the deaths, the coroner began a more detailed analysis. Almost immediately, he realized these deaths were not accidental. Both Darrell Perry and 22-year-old Annie had died from multiple stab wounds. Crystal had been strangled. The young family found dead inside an isolated Mississippi vacation home had been brutally murdered. After autopsies revealed that a family of 3 had been the victims of homicide, police in Pike County, Mississippi returned to the remote vacation home where the bodies had been discovered. Now they were looking for clues that could lead them to the killer. But investigators found no signs of forced entry, and all the windows were securely shut. Technicians processed every surface, hoping to find any fingerprints that may have been left behind. But they found none. Whoever had committed these murders had been very careful not to leave any traces behind.
Defense attorneys requested they be put together.
The lack of any signs of a violent struggle or forced entry led investigators to suspect that the victims likely knew their killer. Hopeful the victim's family could provide useful information, investigators traveled to Louisiana to interview Darrell Perry's mother, Doris, and her husband, Michael Rubenstein, who had discovered the bodies. Michael explained that he had driven the family to his remote Mississippi retreat in early November. His stepson, Darrell, and Darrell's wife, Annie, had recently gotten back together after a long separation. Annie's young daughter from a previous marriage desperately needed a father figure in her life. For her sake, Darrell and Annie wanted to make the marriage work. They hoped some quiet time together as a family would make them closer. Michael offered to let them stay at his Mississippi residence. He said he last spoke to Darrell by phone on November 16th.
But the last time I talked to them,
According to Darrell, everything was going fine. But after a month went by without a word, Michael returned to the residence on December 16th. That's when he discovered the bodies. The Rubensteins told police that while Darrell and Annie were separated, Annie had dated a reputed drug dealer named Tony Harris. Harris was rumored to be a violent man. Police quickly located the suspect and brought him in for questioning. But Tony Harris denied any knowledge of the murders. And he had a solid alibi for the first week of December, when the murders had likely occurred.
Not exactly.
He later agreed to take a polygraph test, which indicated he was telling the truth.
No, because of the trees that was
The investigation ground to a halt.
12, that's about 12:50.
How you doing, Mr. Perry? Have a seat, please.
Then, a few days later, Darrell Perry's brother, David, came in to speak with police.
I just wanted to come in. I thought it was an important...
David believed their stepfather, Michael Rubenstein, had committed the murders. He said that he, Darrell, and their stepfather had been involved in insurance scams for years. And from past experience, David believed that Michael Rubenstein would have no problem killing for money.
David gave information that Rubenstein and he and Darrell and other family members had been involved in over the years, that Rubenstein primarily made a living off of insurance scams. He told us of a death where a hunting accident where a partner was killed back in 1979.
Following up on the lead, investigators reviewed the case files for the 1979 death of Rubenstein's business partner. According to court documents, the business partner was killed during a hunting trip when Rubenstein's gun accidentally misfired. No criminal charges were ever brought. But 2 weeks before the accident, the partner had made Rubenstein a beneficiary of his life insurance policy. But when Rubenstein tried to collect on the policy, the insurance company refused to pay. He decided to take the insurance company to court.
Your Honor, one never knows when tragedy is going to strike, and the premiums...
But the law stated that if the policyholder dies within 2 years of signing the paperwork, the insurance company is not required to pay. Rubenstein was reportedly furious at the decision. Believing they were closing in on a suspect and a motive, detectives began interviewing other family members. They learned that Rubenstein had taken a $250,000 life insurance policy on 4-year-old Crystal.
$250,000.
And the policy was dated 2 years and 2 months before the young girl was found murdered. Though incriminating, it didn't prove murder.
We knew now of a motive, which was a $250,000 life insurance policy, and it was just not enough for the DA to accept the case.
When Mississippi police reviewed witness statements, however, they found something that had previously gone overlooked.
Very important.
Several residents who lived near the vacation home where the victims were found murdered had seen Rubenstein in town on November 16th. The suspect previously claimed he hadn't gone to the residence until mid-December, when he discovered the bodies. To prove murder, investigators needed to establish that the family died during Rubenstein's trip to Mississippi in mid-November, not in early December, as the coroner had indicated. And the only evidence detectives had were photographs of the insects taken at the crime scene. Authorities in Summit, Mississippi believed that a $250,000 life insurance policy had led 50-year-old Michael Rubenstein to murder his stepson and his stepson's young wife and child. Though the suspect had been seen near the crime scene on November 16, 1993, the coroner's report indicated the family had died in early December. To resolve the conflicting information and firmly establish a time of death, detectives contacted esteemed forensic anthropologist Dr. William Bass of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. For more than 30 years, Dr. Bass has conducted research at a 3-acre facility known as the Body Farm. Using human bodies that have been donated for scientific research, Dr. Bass has become an expert in how individuals decompose after death.
In law enforcement, you're frequently called upon to determine the length of time since death. And to do that, you need to know what the decay rate is and what the decay sequence is in humans. So this is one of the things that I got interested in, is determining the length of time since death. And in order to do that, then you need to look at how the body decays, how long does it take for that decay to occur, what are the factors like temperature and the insects and so forth that help you to determine the length of time since death.
The larvae of the common blowfly observed in crime scene photographs were about 14 days old, suggesting the family died in early December. But that didn't tell the whole story. When Dr. Bass examined the remains and factored in the temperature data, he concluded from the level of decomposition that the victims had been dead a month before they were discovered on December 16th. After examining photographs of the home where the bodies were found, Dr. Bass believed he could explain the inconsistency.
I agree, the maggots are only 14 days old. But you've got two things going on at the same time. You've got these bodies decaying inside of a house. You've got the flies outside of the house. It takes the flies a few days to begin to get the smell. Hey, there's a dead body in there. Then they have to figure out, how do I get from outside inside so I can lay my eggs on this decaying body? Bill, this is Dr. Bass at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
After weighing all of the evidence, Dr. Bass concluded these victims had been dead 25 to 35 days before being discovered. That put the time of death at mid-November, exactly when Michael Rubenstein had been seen near the residence. Based on Dr. Bass's analysis, Mississippi authorities now had enough evidence to arrest Michael Rubenstein. He was charged with 3 counts of murder. Police believe that when Michael's financial problems became too much, he began plotting to kill his family members and then profit from their deaths. On November 16, 1993, 2 years after taking out a life insurance policy on 4-year-old Crystal, he drove to the residence where Daryl, Annie, and the child were spending time together. There, he brutally murdered the young family. 50-year-old Michael Rubenstein received 2 life sentences for the stabbing deaths of Daryl and Annie Perry. For the murder of 4-year-old Crystal, he received the death penalty. Some killers are skilled at removing any trace of themselves from a crime scene. But nature has its own way of leaving clues behind. Forensic entomologists can kickstart a dying investigation and find proof of murder by uncovering evidence left behind by predators and parasites.